Aura, Components, Basics, Attributes and Expressions. Learning Objectives. After completing this unit, you'll be able to define attributes on your components and pass attribute values into nested components, understand the difference between a component definition and a component instance and create multiple instances of a component, create basic expressions to display changing and calculated values, and create conditional expressions for dynamic output. Component attributes. To this point, while we've created a couple of components and learned a fair bit about building apps with them at a high level, the code we've written isn't doing much more than what plain HTML does. That is, the two components we've created output the same static text, no matter what we do. You could put a dozen of them on the same screen, and they'd always say the same thing. Boring. To change that, we need to learn two things. First, we need to learn how to enable a component to accept input when it's created. That is, we need to set values on the component. We do this using attributes. The second thing we need to learn is how to actually use these values to change a component's behavior and output. We'll do that after we figure out attributes. Attributes on components are like instance variables in objects. They're a way to save values that change and a way to name those value placeholders. For example, let's say we wanted to write a hello message component that prints a custom message. We can envision adding a message attribute to this component to customize its output, and then we can set that message when we add the component to our app, like the following. You'll want to add this to your org, because we'll use it a few more times as we go. But if you do it now, you'll get an error. Why is that? Because the hello message component doesn't exist yet. Salesforce validates your code as you write it. If you try to save code that it knows is invalid, for example, reinforcing a non-existent component, you'll get an error. So let's figure out how to create hello message first. You can set a component's attribute when you create it, as we did in the preceding example. You can also change them over the course of the component's lifecycle in response to actions the user takes, or events that happen elsewhere, and so on. And you can of course read and use attribute values in a number of different ways. We'll look at those when we get to expressions. For the moment, let's look at how you define attributes for a component. An attribute is defined using an aura::attribute tag, which requires values for the name and type attributes and accepts those optional attributes: default, description, required. Whoa, that's a lot of different ways to use attribute in a sentence. It's really easy to get confused here because we have three different concepts with similar names. Let's be specific. A component attribute is the place where you can store a value. In the preceding example, the hello message component has a component attribute named message. Most of the time, we're talking about component attributes. You define a component attribute using the aura::attribute tag. We'll see an example of that momentarily. Let's call these attribute definitions. Number 3, the aura::attribute tag itself takes attributes when you use it. That is, when you define a component attribute using the aura::attribute tag, you set attributes on aura::attribute that specify the shape of the component attribute you're defining. Wait, let's try again. Add a component attribute definition by setting attributes on the attribute's definition. A component attribute's attribute definition takes attributes? This is why writers. Let's try to solve this terminology problem with some code. Here's the start of our hello message component. The hello message component has one component attribute, and that attribute is defined by setting the name and type of the attribute. The name of the attribute is message, and once we learn about expressions, that's how you'll reference it. It still only outputs static text in HTML, but we're inching closer to something useful. The other attribute we've used here is type, and we've set it because it's required in an attribute definition. It says that the message attribute contains a string, which makes sense. We'll talk more about attribute data types and the other parts of attribute definitions, but first let's learn about expressions and make hello message actually do something. Expressions. Instead of getting lost in words again, let's dive right into making hello message work as intended. Is that anticlimactic or what? We're outputting the contents of message using the expression open curly bracket bang v.message close curly bracket. That is, this expression references the message attribute. The expression is evaluated and resolves to the text string that's currently stored in message, and that's what the expression outputs into the body of the component. What the heck is an expression? An expression is basically a formula or a calculation which you place within expression delimiters, open curly bracket, bang, and close curly bracket. So expressions look like the following: open curly bracket, bang, write your expression, close curly bracket. The formal definition of an expression is a bit intimidating, so let's look at and then unpack it. An expression is any set of literal values, variables, sub-expressions, or operators that can be resolved to a single value. Yep, basically a formula, much like you'd write in a calculation field, filter criteria, or visual force. The formula or expression can contain a variety of things. Literal values should be obvious. They're things like the number 42 or the string hello. Variables are things like the message attribute. Operators are things like plus, minus, and so on. And sub-expressions basically means you can use parentheses to group things together. Let's try this out by making our expression slightly more complex. All we've done is move the hello part from static text outside the expression to literal text inside the expression. Notice that we've used the plus operator to concatenate the two strings together. This might seem like a pretty small difference, but moving the greeting text inside the expression lets you use labels instead of literal text, which makes it easier to update and translate your components. For example, did you notice what our formal definition of expressions left out? JavaScript function calls. You can't use JavaScript in expressions in Aura components markup. One last thing about expressions before we move on. You can pass them to another component to set the value on that component. Here's a new component that passes in a custom value to the hello message component. Passing the value to the other component overrides the value on that component. Value providers. Actually, we need to talk about another aspect of expressions. In the preceding examples, we've referenced the hello message component's message attribute with a v.message. What's the v dot part? V is something called a value provider. Value providers are a way to group, encapsulate, and access related data. Value providers are a complicated topic, so for now, think of v as an automatic variable that's made available for you to use. And our component v is a value provider for the view, which is the hello message component itself. V gives you a hook to access the component's message attribute, and it's how you access all of the component's attributes. Values in a value provider are accessed as named properties. To use a value, separate the value provider and the property name with a dot, a period. For example, v.message, as we've seen. When an attribute of a component is an object or other structured data, that is, not a primitive value, access the values on that attribute using the same dot notation. For example, open curly bracket, bang, v.account.id, close curly bracket, accesses the ID field of an account record. For deeply nested objects and attributes, continue adding dots to traverse the structure and access the nested values. Attribute data types. Accessing structured data is a nice segue back to talking about attributes, and specifically about non-primitive attribute types. Message is a string, but there are a number of different attribute types. Primitive data types, such as Boolean, date, datetime, decimal, double, integer, long, or string, the usual suspects in any programming language. Standard and custom Salesforce objects, such as account, or my custom object, _C. Collections, such as lists, map, and set. Custom Apex classes. Framework-specific types, such as aura.component or aura.component, as an array. These are more advanced than we'll get in this module, but you should know they exist. Here's a stripped-down look at the expense item component, which we'll fill in later. It illustrates how you define an attribute for a custom object and how to access fields on a record. This component has one attribute, expense, which is the custom object we created way back at the start of this module. The component's purpose is to display the details of an expense by referencing the field on the expense _C record using the open curly bracket, bang, v.expense.fieldname, close curly bracket expression. We're using the lightning : input component of type equals toggle, which is a checkbox in the form of a toggle so that we can update the value in the UI later. Other aspects of attribute definitions. When it comes to the attributes you set on the aura : attribute tag, here's the rest of what you'll need to know. The default attribute defines the default attribute value. It's used when the attribute is referenced and you haven't yet set the attribute's value. The required attribute defines whether the attribute is required. The default is false. The description attribute defines a brief summary of the attribute and its usage. Setting the default value for an attribute with a complex data type can be kind of tricky. We'll see an example later though, so for now we'll just give you the heads up. Fun with attributes and expressions. To illustrate a few more concepts about attributes and expressions, let's create a really silly component, Hello Playground, with the following markup. Now add the Hello Playground component to your Harness app and see how it runs. There's a number of new things here. We won't go into depth on them right now, but you'll see all of these again. First, Hello Playground has one attribute, messages, that's a complex data type, list, and it has a default value for that list, an array of 3 single quoted strings separated by commas, and in the list items section, you can see how to access each of the strings using an index. What happens if someone creates a C:"Hello Playground with only 2 messages? Accessing the third item will fail, and while it won't cause a crash here, with more complex components, it might. So in the list iteration section, you can see a better way to work through all items in the list. The aura:"iteration component repeats its body once per item in its items attribute, so the list shrinks or grows as we have fewer or more messages. In the conditional expression and global value providers section, you can see a way to choose between 2 different possible outputs. The format is a bit awkward because this is markup rather than, say, JavaScript, but the aura:"if component lets you, for example, add an edit button to a page only if the user has edit privileges on the object. Finally, something that is a little less obvious. In object-oriented programming, there's a difference between a class and an instance of that class. Components have a similar concept. When you create a .cmp resource, you are providing the definition class of that component. When you put a component tag in a .cmp, you are creating a reference to that instance of that component. It shouldn't be surprising that we can add multiple instances of the same component with different attributes. In the preceding example, when you use the default value for messages, you'll end up with 8 references to instances of our C:"Hello Message component. If you pass in a longer list, you can end up with many more, all from our one little component. And with that, friend, we think you're